Hi there, welcome to the latest episode of Craig Houston Talks to podcast. And the guest today is well-known journalist Jo Bartosch, who has come on to talk to me, help educate me and enlighten me to a topic I've just stumbled on recently, and I'm very interested to find out more about it. The topic is this divide and the reasons behind the divide between the LGB community and the rest of the letters of the alphabet that have gradually been added on to their campaign, which was a very successful campaign. So that's what we're going to talk about, and just like to welcome Jo to the podcast. How are you today, Jo?
Oh, very well. Thank you so much for inviting me on. I think it's a fascinating topic. So yeah, I'm happy to talk to you about it.
Yeah, and I believe you've been doing a lot of writing about it, and a lot of people, a lot of outlets ask for your opinion and write pieces for them on the topic. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's pretty much been the main thing that I've written about now for around about sort of 6-7 years. So it's kind of taken over my life as well. I do have a interest outside of it, but it is at once sort of fascinating and enraging, and I think it cuts through so many other issues in terms of how we see the world, sort of. And I think once you start questioning this, it really sort of opens up lots of other topics. It's yeah.
Mhm. Could you do a favour before we go into the topic? Could you just introduce yourself to the guests who may not be aware of you and your work, please?
Yeah, certainly. So my name's Jo Bartosch, and I actually got into to writing on this through feminist campaigning years and years ago, and then I became a journalist, and I'm now assistant editor at The Critic. And I write a lot for Spiked, Telegraph, just basically anyone who asks me and pays me.
And the topic, I'll give you where I am as a 51-year-old heterosexual, and how I viewed this whole thing, and maybe explain why I became interested in it when I found out my understanding was pretty away from the reality of the thing. The LGBT community started off this movement with, the pride flag and things like that. And as an outsider, I could understand that. I could understand that the LGBT community desired the same sort of rights as I had, particularly, partnerships and things like that, where I had protection by the law, etc. And I thought, well, that kind of makes sense to me. I've got protection if I was in a relationship, in a sort of common law relationship, as we have up here, gave me protection, financial protection, etc., etc. So why should a same-sex relationship and couple not have the same as me? So I kind of thought, well, that's a decent thing for society to accept. And that campaign went along, and from what I can see from the outside, was successful. And I've now, in the last couple of months, because I'm interested in a specific topic, spoke to a lot of the LGB community, and they seem quite happy with a lot. The world might not be perfect, but from where we were when I was a child in the 80s, coming through, that the way that particularly homosexual men, I felt were treated quite poorly. So I thought, well, that campaign's been successful, and I understood what the flag was all about, and understood. And then we get to today, and you go, well, the world is not a bad place for the LGBT community. However, this whole thing was still being driven into my life, which became a bit weird. And every sort of few months, there seemed to be another letter added to it, and I just accepted, probably because that's what I was meant to accept, that this whole thing was one thing. And I was quite amazed to find out that it wasn't. And the vast majority, now correct me if I'm wrong, but it appears to me, in my limited knowledge of it, that the vast majority of the LGBT community have the same opinions as the straight community, that it concerns them, this whole drive for gender. So that's where I am. Is my reading of the situation correct, Jo? Is that sort of a decent analogy of where we are?
Yeah, I think that's broadly spot on. I mean, I think, to be honest, most people, well, regardless of their sexuality, haven't really thought about it. I think the reason it has become such a massive issue, and it's described by one of my favourites of academics as a men's sexual rights movement, and I think that's true. I think essentially men who once would have been seen as cross-dressers are now identifying as trans, and they're gaining legal protections. So when it comes to the fight for equality between people of different sexual orientations, I think broadly that was won in 2013, when we gained equal marriage. So, you know, we can adopt on equal terms, we can marry who we want. Essentially, there wasn't that much left to fight, but you still had all these legacy big organizations like Stonewall that wanted to keep the income coming in. And it was in 2014 that Ruth Hunt took over Stonewall. And without surveying or asking for the opinions of anybody that she once represented, with the, you know, LGB, same-sex attracted people, they did a massive sort of piece of work to include people who identify as trans. Now, the thing is, there's no actual definition of trans. So that can include somebody who we might call a transsexual. So that's a very tiny proportion of people who have had operations to look like they're the opposite sex and might have taken hormones to look like the opposite sex. But as I say, that's a very small number of people. And to be honest, even if they've undertaken medical procedures, that doesn't mean they are literally the opposite sex. And that was always kind of understood. And I mean, going right back, actually, one of the first people who began to point out that there was an issue here was a lesbian feminist called Janice Raymond. And she wrote a book called The Transsexual Empire in 1979. And she warned about this. So she was really prescient. So she warned about straight men who had a sexual fetish for identifying with lesbians. And she was like, this is going to start having a problem within like women-only communities, which were obviously just starting to form as part of the feminist community and as part of the lesbian community in particular. And she was sort of ignored, and she was right. It's happened. And I think in part that's because of the explosion of pornography, but that's a kind of related issue. And yeah, I think essentially it's being recast as a civil rights movement when actually it's not at all. It's essentially, for a lot of men, it's a fetish. And I think for a lot of women, it's just easier to pass as the opposite sex than it is to come out as a lesbian.
Yeah, I get that. And my own personal experience, over my life, I've had two long interactions. I don't mean, you know, somebody talking to me in a bus stop, with people who describe themselves as having gender dysphoria. Now, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a professor, you know, I'm not medically trained, but I understood what they're saying, you know, and one of them was a customer of mine that we had a family business at the time in my early youth, and I spent a lot of time talking to Jade. I was quite nervous about it at first, but I learned at that time, this would have been late 80s, early 90s, for Jade to be fully accepted as a woman, she had to live like a woman for 2 years before they would even consider doing anything with her, you know, medically. And that's where Jade was in this process at the time. And I found it interesting because I'm a sort of nosy bugger, and things out with my normal bubble interest me. So I could understand the torment that Jade must have went through during her life. And then later on in my life, I interviewed a trans person who was going the opposite direction, female to male, and eventually gave this person a job. So, you know, I learned a bit, not as much as I had through the Jade experience. And I was kind of getting the point that, you know, gender dysphoria may be a thing, right? So I'm perfectly agreeable to that being a possibility. But it must be a very, very, very small percentage of people. But the whole trans thing to me is not about these two people that I've had experiences with. That's managed to expand into, well, and as you say, it's not defined. It's not defined to people who have been, you know, medical people say you've got gender dysphoria. It's now to include people who just want to dress up and be a bit weird, right? So what is the true number? How many people have got this thing, or, you know, whether it's right or wrong, called gender dysphoria, and how many of them are just guys with strange fetishes?
I mean, we don't know. It's the absolute answer. It's impossible to tell. I think there's some dispute around the existence of gender dysphoria. I happen to think it probably does affect some people, and I think it's the same. I mean, when you look at women who feel discomfort in their body, most women feel discomfort on the body. Otherwise, they wouldn't wear makeup, and, you know, they'd be kind of happy to just be how they are. So I think, in a way, some level of gender dysphoria, whether it's having, I don't know, breast implants because you feel your breasts are too small or whatever it happens to be, I think is kind of normal. A lot of people feel discomfort in their bodies. I think when it comes to the extreme that you really feel you need to present as the opposite sex, I have some sympathy for that. But at the same time, I don't think the rest of the world should be able to play along. And I don't actually think it's necessarily kind for the rest of the world to play along either. So this is often sort of presented as something as about kindness. Well, if somebody told me they thought they were Napoleon, I might say, well, that's nice, but I don't think I'd sort of indulge their delusion. So even if people do have gender dysphoria, like, if an anorexic person thinks they're fat, I'm not going to kind of go along with it because I think actually that's harmful. So that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah. I think, and someone else discussed a similar notion with me, that, and people might say this is harsh, but it's probably not a physical ailment people have got, it's probably in here, right? So if we accept that, then it must be the only thing that people have a mental health issue with that we play along with. Now, for example, I gave the example when I was talking to someone recently that I've suffered from mental health problems in the past. Now, if I seen someone potentially wanting to act out, follow through with a suicide, you wouldn't hand them a knife. You wouldn't say, you know something, you're right. Someone's at the end of their tether. The world would be better without me. I just need to go. You wouldn't say, do you know what? I agree with you. And as the example you gave, we don't, with anorexia and other mental health issues, we tend not to just agree with the person. We try and help them. And now, with any therapies that can do that with trans, we're told they're bad. So how we deal with 99% on any other sort of mental health issue I can think of, we have to deal with that totally different than we do with trans people. And if you try to bring someone out of that state of mind, then you're a bad person. And they're trying to ban these conversion therapies. I don't get it. I like to sort of use applied common sense and logic, Jo, and I just can't get to it with this subject.
No, I mean, the conversion therapy thing, I think, was a totally confected campaign. So, I mean, there's a lot of money behind this. So, when I mentioned in 2014, when Stonewall adopted the T formally to the LGB, so it started making moves to, they got a huge grant from an international donor called the Arcus Foundation. And there's a lot of money sloshing around pushing this because, apart from anything else, it makes the pharmaceutical companies a lot of money because they end up with lifelong bloody medical patients because they constantly then have to have hormones, artificial hormones, and then of course it feeds into surrogacy because most of the people who've been through these procedures will then be infertile. So it's a whole kind of pharmaceutical network of associated industries, if you like, that go with so-called trans medicine. And I think when it comes to conversion therapy in particular, there's hardly any evidence that it happens in the UK. It's just not really a thing. And I think when people, it's such an emotive topic because when people think about it, they think about gay people with electrodes in their heads. That just doesn't happen in the UK.
Kind of moved on from that, haven't we?
Yeah, and rightfully so, thankfully so. But it is totally different from being able to talk to a kid who feels like their body is wrong. We're starting to get as well a wave of detransitioners, both from the Sandford Clinic in Scotland and the Tavistock Clinic, which has now thankfully been shut in the UK, in England. So yeah, I think there's a lot of money. It's very much a confected campaign. It's an internationally sort of funded campaign, and it sort of uses all the language of human rights, but it's not really about human rights at all. It's just kind of riding on the coattails of same-sex attracted people. And of course, the irony is that trans itself is a form of conversion therapy. So, for a lot of, one of the first indicators with children that they might grow up to be gay or lesbian or bisexual is that they tend to adopt a lot of the behaviors and that are commonly associated with the opposite sex. So I don't quite know why it is, but it's a thing. And if they are then told at school, as now so many kids are, that actually means they might be the opposite sex and that they've somehow sort of, mystically been born into the wrong body, which is obviously nonsense, then they will grow up and they will have surgeries and all the rest of it. Eventually they'll be put on a medical pathway that means they will become infertile. So I think what we are doing is this is sterilizing a generation of gay, lesbian and bisexual youth. It is a massive human rights abuse, and also traumatized kids, because, you know, kids who have been sexually abused or whatever, of course they feel like they're disconnected from their bodies. But rather than sort of encouraging kids to understand that they are just who they are and that's okay, it's a really dangerous and I think sort of quite a sinister movement, actually. So I think in itself, telling a child that they might be born in the wrong body is quite often a form of conversion therapy.
No, I agree with that. And I think the reason that I became interested in the topic before I understood the split the LGB community, which I found a sort of fascinating side subject. But my concern was the trans rights movement. That was my first concern. And that was led by the issues we had up here in Scotland with the gender recognition bill, which I'm sure, you know, I talk to many English people about it and I'm not too sure about it, but I would imagine someone as learned as yourself will be well aware of what happened up here. And I've got I've got a son and a daughter in my daughter's late teens. And I have this pre-programmed position, I believe, which people will probably tell me I'm misogynistic because as a 51-year-old guy, I sometimes lose track of what isn't acceptable out there. And my sort of pre-programmed thought and belief is that you tend to protect women. So that was my introduction to this. And, you know, if that notion is alien to common belief just now, then I apologise, I'm just a dinosaur. But that's where I was coming to from with this whole thing. And where I am with this and in a whole range of topics, I believe society should try its best to look after the minority. And regardless of what that is, we should have a look at it and say, does this make sense? Now, if we can help the minority of people, whatever it is they've got an issue with, whether gender or sexual orientation or colour or religion, etc., if we can accommodate someone's desires where they feel they're possibly persecuted and things, and it does not affect the majority of people, then I think that's a no-brainer. I think it's, well, can we do that? Can we make you a bit happier? And I think the LGB, rights thing was probably one of those things where the majority of people had an issue. Can we deal with it in society? Does it affect everybody else? No, it doesn't. Great, let's do it. Let's do it. It makes sense to me. But when we have things where we're dealing with a percentage of people that you and I actually cannot define how small it is, which affects the majority of people, because we've got more than 50% of people in Scotland are female, and I just don't see why we have to cave in. We have to let these people go into women's safe spaces. I find the whole notion deplorable. I worked in London for a few years as a sales director for a industrial cleaning company, and I've done a lot of work in the third sector. And we had one customer who had safe places for women who had been sexually and physically abused. And they had lots of protocols that we had to adhere to. There were certain areas we couldn't go into. There were certain jobs that we had to send women only cleaners to and things like that. And I get that. I totally understand that. And then we had a case in Edinburgh where the chief executive officer of the Edinburgh Rape Centre is a man who wants me to believe he's a woman. And I just think, just in so many levels, how the hell did we get here? How did we get to a position that if I put a dress on, I can go and apply for a job as a CEO of a rape centre, and then, as I found out with Neil in the conversation I had with Neil Hanvey yesterday, I was underguessing the situation. What they were doing in that place was, if the rape victims, now you've got to understand who I'm talking about here, the rape victims, if they made comment that that was a man, they were told that they were bigoted and they were to change their behaviour. And there's evidence somewhere of suggesting that this rape centre has said that it will not deal and not give support to rape victims who don't toe this line that CEO is a man. And you think, where is we going as society with this, Jo? It's just ridiculous. And that's why I had my initial interest, was the safety of women. And then when I started finding out about, how this whole thing's been snowballed into the LGB thing, and LGB, I just presumed, because I see this flag that changes every other week and these letters of the alphabet that get bigger, that everybody in those letters of the alphabet are in agreement with, how wrong was I? And that became apparent just through my initial concern, which was for the safety of women, which is the majority of people in Scotland. and the whole thing's bizarre. If people have got issues and they need support from society and it doesn't affect anybody else and it just makes them a wee bit happier, then as long as it's not harming anybody, I'm kind of cool in the gang with that.
Yeah.
But when we've to change our normal way of thinking to accommodate, and such a small number that you, as someone who's far more learned in the subject than me, can't actually put a number on it, so small, the world's gone mad.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why I sort of love that phrase of it being a men's sexual rights movement, because you're right, we can't protect women if we can't define women. And when it comes to, for example, Midral Wadhwa, who I think is the chief executive you're talking about, he has been in the women's sector pretty much his entire career. Yeah. And I think in part that's ironically because the women he'll have been working with have been socialized to be kind, to be nice, because if we're not kind and nice, we're judged more harshly than men when men are straight down the line. It's just a kind of social thing. That's kind of in the same way as you feel an urge to protect. I think we've kind of got this expectation that we need to be kind. And I think that's how he's managed to force his way in there. And obviously, for a man who thinks he's a woman, there's nothing more validating than being surrounded by, being in a women-only space. So that's kind of, ticking every one of his boxes. And I think it's really dangerous. And then we see the cases, again, in Scotland, like, remember him? So he was a butcher, he was a cross-dressing
Oh, yes,
butcher,
yes.
Abducted a girl. And she got into his car because she described him as a lady, I think, in her, in the, if you go through the sort of the case. And I thought, oh my God, this poor girl. She thought, because he cross-dressed, because that's what should have been bloody taught at school. She would have been taught at school, thanks to all the sort of, the sort of initiatives to send drag queens in and all the rest of it, that if somebody cross-dresses, that means they're literally the opposite sex. And kids believe stuff like that. So her whole sense of reality, her whole sense of, when you're a kid and you're just developing those systems to work out who's a threat. Well, to be brutally honest, we know that, for example, 98% of those convicted of sexual violence are men. 95% of the prison population is male. That's not to say all men, but it's enough that women need to be able to trust their instincts, to be able to kind of, to have spaces where we can have space away from men, where we can be safe, whether that's hospital wards. And given that around 1 in 5 women have been sexually assaulted, have been raped, that's particularly important because it's very traumatizing to be in a space, particularly after something like that's happened. So yeah, I think the impact on everything from children's sense of reality to women's safety is so significant. And when it comes to gay rights, I think the other massive issue is that if you define what a man or a woman is by somebody's internal sense of themselves, then you essentially eliminate the whole idea of either being homosexual or indeed heterosexual. Because if you say that, any man who identifies as a woman is a woman, so, by definition, the only type of man that can be a trans woman, the only type of person that can be a trans woman is a man. So essentially we're saying and it doesn't matter whether he's had surgery or not. So you are essentially saying that lesbians can have penises. That is what you are saying. And you are saying gay men can have vulvas, which is so insulting. I mean, that's right back to 1950s style. You just haven't met the right, man yet to lesbians or vice versa. It is so aggressive and so sexist because obviously it's based on stereotypes. It's bonkers that it's being presented as if it's something forward-thinking and inclusive when actually it's just a horrible movement and really destabilizing, and I think quite dangerous for kids as well.
Yeah, and I think any human being that doesn't have a concern for the safety of kids isn't a human being. I think we're all programmed that way, or we should be, right? And this is a bit that, I find frightening, and I'll give you a wee insight into my journey from my angle. About 3 years ago, I saw a video of a guy who I now know. He is a member of the Scottish Family Party, which is a sort of Christian-based political party up here. And I saw this video of this guy, this stranger at the time, and he was in a setting where John Swinney was Education Minister at the time, and he was on a stage and he challenged them about what we were teaching kids, right? And I must admit, at that time, I thought, that's a lunatic preacher. That's no painting a picture of reality at all, because what he was saying seemed so absurd to me that I thought, this cannot possibly be what we're teaching kids at school. This man is evidently bonkers. And it turned out he wasn't bonkers. He was, but at the time, that's how I processed it. I thought, it's just nuts. And now we've got a situation in Scotland where we have an organisation called LGB Scotland, who are given carte blanche access to all our schools, and they'll now give you a nice certificate to tell everybody how inclusive you are as a school. And part of that is you've got to have like a trans right champion in your school. And I'm thinking, but it's primary schools that they're doing most of their work is in high schools, for 12-year-olds upwards. But now they're moving into the primary schools in Scotland, and you can get a nice certificate from for your school. Now, these are a Quangle stroke charity that's heavily funded by the Scottish Government. And I just find this whole thing rather distasteful. But as I learn more about how the third sector works, and how when our Parliament want to put what they call an independent committee up, they've already decided what they want the outcome to be. So the only Quangos that get invited in are the ones that they're supporting financially, and they know what they're going to say. And I have had people tell me stories about charities who were not willing to pull the party line, and have actually had their funding totally withdrawn. And you think, well, this is just a game now. This is not about doing what's best for people. This is now financially led. And I've only got one example of campaigning my whole life, and that was 10 years ago. It was a football-related thing where the team I support were run by people that I wasn't too happy with. They were unscrupulous people. And I started a campaign to remove them. And anytime I had any questions in my own head, I just followed the money. And you found the answer as to why these strange things were happening. So when I started showing an interest in this, I was like, where is the money? And then through a conversation you and I had last week, I kind of figured out and can see where the money is now. And you were explaining to me the history of Stonewall, etc. And now, because I'll just reiterate how you told it to me, was Stonewall had came to the sort of end of its time. There was nothing else to campaign for. And well, what do we do next? Because by that point, they've got CEOs and directors and all these people paying handsomely from this thing. And if they don't have any to campaign for, then they're not there anymore. So they sort of grabbed onto this as a second thing to campaign for and keep the whole industry alive. And then when you think, and when you're saying about the pharma companies, and there's all these people now who are financially involved in this whole thing, then it makes sense. But then when you rewind that and you say, well, okay, but we're hurting children. We're teaching children wrong things. We're potentially mutilating them. We're potentially sterilising them. We're potentially wrecking their minds forever, just so some people in our society can be a bit richer. That is horrific, Jo.
Yeah. Well, not just that, but also so that some men can have their fetish validated and accepted by society. Yeah. I mean, it's just. I mean, I was thinking about the sort of first stirrings of sort of discontent that I saw from within the LGB community, and there's an excellent campaigner called Julia Long. So she's always kind of been quite vocal against this. But it was actually, I think it was in Brighton. It was the last Pride March I went to. It was in Brighton in 2016, and there was a group of radical feminists there. You had a banner saying, I think it was like positively revolting women, and they're all lesbians. And I was like, oh, and that kind of like tipped me off that actually there was a bit of dissent brewing, because already at that stage you could just see there was this takeover of like bloody human pups. And, I mean, it's always been, I don't think, particularly family friendly, but you could just see there was this kind of like growing movement of basically fetishists who were calling themselves the protected minority. And then it was in 2018, so there was a group called Get the L Out, and they did a brilliant protest. They held up London Pride March with banners saying lesbians don't have penises and stuff like that. And they were absolutely monsters. They were just given hell in the sort of pages of the Guardian, and you know, they were sort of
Mhm.
made out as if they were like, you know, frothing fascists. And I happen to know these women, and most of them are actually quite left wing. You know,
Yeah.
but just as your family, the family party bloke was kind of dismissed as a religious nut, they were sort of just dismissed as sort of insane feminist nutters. It doesn't matter what it is, you just kind of get dismissed. And it's terribly unjust. And then of course we've had people losing their jobs over this. So there's Alison Bailey. She took her employers to court. She was a lawyer. She's now, well, she's a barrister, and she ended up, you know, a black lesbian barrister ended up having to take Stonewall and her employers to court because they tried to force her out because she dared to suggest that, you know, maybe there was something wrong going on.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But I think there's so many topics in society that's how it evolves. That the first person to put, hold on a minute, let's just, reevaluate this situation here. They get just, the cancel culture kicks in and all this stuff that follows, and then eventually the rest of the world catch up. And there's, and what was described as fascist and all this nonsense not so long ago. Did you say that was 2019, Jo?
The London March, where Get the Hell Out did the protest, that was 2018.
2018. So we're not talking about a long time ago, where they were seen as extremists.
Yep.
And now, unless I'm picking up the vibe wrong and not reading the room, it seems to me as if that's the sort of central opinion now that we need to question these things.
Yeah.
So that's not in a lot of things that I think society. Anyway, we're great at labelling people. We're great at putting an obia on the end of something and tagging somebody. I mean, I get reminded just yesterday when I was doing my previous campaign 10 years ago. I had a blog written about me where I was a homophobic, racist bigot. And I was like, all right, okay. And the guy that wrote it was declared bankrupt. So you're like, the legal advice I took was just let it run. It's no, there's no made that. He was trying to get it in the mainstream news, and that's how I became aware of it, because a journalist pointed it out to me and said, look, this guy's trying to hawk this story. So there was sort of some fringe blog sites type put it out, right? So I just left it. And then it popped up again just yesterday. And it was quite funny because I was telling Neil about the situation because he had an anti-Semitic claim made about him previously, where he was the devil, right? And I said, it's funny that, Neil, about 10 years ago, I had this thing where I was a homophobic, racist bigot. I said, and that's just to silence you. And then I came home that night and someone had pulled this thing up for 10 years ago. And because I'm now getting a small sort of platform politically, it's, he actually tagged Neil in and said, Neil, you're an openly gay man. Do you realise you've just done this podcast with this homophobic guy? And I thought, that's bizarre because I just happened to take it. And the mad thing is, this is how homophobic I am. I didn't realise Neil was homosexual until I was doing some research and I went through his Wikipedia and found out he's been married to a guy happily for 20 years, right? And I'd met him at an event about the week before it. And like, that's where society is now. It's, who cares? Do you know what I mean? We're past it being even something that you need to know about somebody before you start becoming friends with them. But that's where society is. And, Neil's, you're an anti-Semite and these people are fascists, and we just love putting bloody labels on people.
So it's so worrying because it empties the labels of any meaning. So, I get called homophobic, like, and I've been called racist and just like mad stuff that has absolutely no basis in reality, just for questioning people's bloody mad belief that they're the opposite sex and that we should also go along with it. And I do think that social media, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but I do think it's true that you end up with sort of very polarized opinions because that's what gets the clicks on social media. I do think that's true.
Yeah. But am I right in reading the room here that it's a sort of middle ground now? It's normal for people to say, hold on a minute, and question this whole movement. Is that where we are as society, or have we got a bit of work to do to get there?
Within the UK, we're getting there. I mean, I happen to agree with you in terms of the union being quite important, because I think had Scotland had gone independent, I think you'd have obviously relied more on the European Union, and I think that would have probably changed the narrative. So I think within the UK, we're kind of like creating a little free speech enclave.
Yeah.
I think the rest of the world is kind of catching up. I also think we are at a genuine risk of, because same-sex attracted people have been lumped in with these nutters, I think we are at genuine risk of losing some of our rights. I've already seen there's been a decline in support for gay marriage, and various other things. And, you know, and there's a totally understandable move to the right across a lot of Europe. I think what's kind of ironic is it's not an economic move to the rightness. It's, you know, we're sort of economically, I feel like everybody has sort of accepted the neoliberal thing, but politically we've had this, or sort of socially we've had this sort of the dominance of the left, or the sort of extreme left. So I can kind of see why there's been a resurgence of the right across Europe. And obviously I think Trump's probably going to get in, isn't he? So I can kind of see, actually, in some respects, whilst this absolutely transcends politics, I think there is a risk that we might end up with a massive backlash against the sensible gains that people have made, for example, to be able to adopt. Sorry, that was a bit garbled, yeah. You know what I mean?
No, I get there. No, I just find the, and I don't think it's just on this one thing, right? I think there's a swing towards common sense and logic on a broad spectrum of topics where previously they were, you know, you shouldn't talk about them. And I think that's why there was such a kickback with the Hate Bill Act when it was brought in through this. And I done quite an interesting podcast with one of Scotland's leading KCs. I keep calling him a QC because that's just a 51-year-old habit. He's now a KC because we no longer have a Queen. And what we took out of that was that although probably not a lot of people will get arrested for it, because if you're really, really obviously hateful to someone, there's laws already that you can be arrested, you know, and look after that. So although there might not be an upturn in arrests through people getting arrested through hate crime, what it will do is it will stifle speech. Because I'm talking to a KC, a very, very clever man, who said, Craig, there's a lot of topics that I just do not talk of, and I don't talk about. And that's because society sort of steam in and, you know, pile on to you. He said, and now I'm not going to talk about some other subjects for the fear of being potentially prosecuted. So the Hate Bill Act will probably not arrest a lot of people, but even by it being there, will stifle debate. And who gets to decide what is and isn't acceptable? And there was some bizarre aspects of the Hate Crime Act. And one of them, again, I'm looking at it from this preconception that we should look after women. My belief, having worked with people in the third sector that look after rape victims previously, I strongly believe that being raped, sexually assaulted, whether you're a woman, which will be the majority of the cases, a child, which is horrific, or a man, which is a small amount of cases, it must be the hardest crime to report. Because the only crime I can think worse is murder, and you're never going to need to report that because you're dead, right? So if you're going to be raped or sexually abused, it must be horrific to go through that door in the police station and say, I need to report this crime. However, the Hate Bill Act came about, and to report some of the Hate Crime Act, we actually made it easier for them. We set up centres across Scotland where people were allowed to go in, not police stations, and report alleged hate crimes. And you're like, there was a sex shop in Glasgow that was selling sex toys, you know, purely for the gay community, or maybe gay community, it might just be, you know, guys that you're talking about that get their kicks out of some weird ways. And you're like, why would you do that? So we've now made it easier in Scotland to report something if your perception is that I've said something homophobic, Islamophobic, racist. We made it easier to report that than rape. And you're like, how do we get there? The world confuses me, Jo. And I don't understand a lot of it, but that's why I'm doing things like this, because, you know, I want to understand it. And the world's gone mad. Why would you have a society that panders to people that are evidently crackpots, right, to report things that they put, oh, that upset me, right, when it's so difficult for a woman that's been raped to report it? I don't understand that. That just, you know, I can't process that. But that's where we are. But I do sense that on this topic and a lot of other topics, the middle ground of society is probably a lot of saying, bugger it, we've had enough. We're not putting up with nonsense anymore.
I think the thing I think is quite difficult is that kind of isn't a middle ground, in that you can either sort of, you know, go along with it and just say, you know, we respect everybody's internal sense of themselves and blah, blah, blah. Or you go, no, actually, reality's a thing. Sorry. You know,
Can I accept reality, please?
Yeah, it's like there isn't really you either sort of, you know, believe in what you can see in front of you, or you take everybody else's word for how they feel themselves to be. So it's kind of, and yes, you know, you can spend a lot of time fantasy, you know, sort of, you know, pandering to people's fantasies and trying to sort of make them feel better about themselves. But ultimately, when it comes to rights, you cannot have rights based on somebody's self-perception or their fantasy. It has to be about material reality. So I do think it's kind of inevitable, because it takes so much effort to sustain a lie, you know, that I think in a way truth will out, which is encouraging. And, you know, we're slowly seeing like the systems that we've built up over centuries swinging into action. So the example of the defeat of Section 35 of the Scotland Bill with regards to gender recognition. So I think these sort of like really ancient structures are slowly grinding into action. But the pace of change, I mean, there was a very deliberate strategy. I don't know if you're aware of the Denton's document.
I don't know that.
So that was, it was put together by a group of lawyers, international group of lawyers, working for ILGA, which is the International Lesbian and Gay Association, who are now purely trans. That's all they do. And they actually said within that document, the way we need to force change across the world is to get ahead of the law and to get around the media narrative and to tack it on to a more popular campaign. So this was in about, I think, 2014, something like that. So this has been, money has been pumped into it. They've had a very deliberate strategy of trying to avoid headlines. And also, I mean, I think the fact they've gone for Malta. So Malta has self-ID. They obviously did it in Ireland. They're going for these like small countries that are quite dependent on international funding. Or, you know what I mean, to try and sort of, or the international community, if not funding, just to try and sort of seed this in, to make it look progressive, to make it look like it's always been, and it's just a natural next step. So I think it's actually taken quite a lot of effort to sustain a lie and to embed the lie. And I think it's going to take quite a lot of effort to rip it back out again, because it has just sort of cemented itself around this be kind narrative. And it kind of seems normal, I think, particularly to those who have been brought up being taught it in schools and universities. I genuinely think they haven't got that many more progressive rights to fight for. You know, I mean, could look at, I don't know, poverty or something actually important, but that's a bit difficult.
Yeah,
So,
no, I mean, the way I've seen the LGB community looking to be just treated the same as me.
yeah.
You know, it's you know, anybody wants to think that's a bad thing, it's crackers, right? So it made sense, and they've been very successful, and rightly so. And societies came on leaps and bounds. I remember I think it was EastEnders, where I first appreciated that some men didn't want to, well, I was a young child at the time, I wasn't old, I thought, you know, didn't want to get into a relationship with women. And it was a character in EastEnders. And I thought, and I was like, I think that was probably the first mainstream character on any sort of thing that was gay. And but you know, that was a bit weird, right? I'm going, all right, so that's a thing, right? Which I hadn't thought about before. And okay. And then I thought, well, why have I not seen that before? And now, but then I think even that's went full circle, because if I was a white heterosexual middle-aged actor, I would probably find it quite difficult to get work now, because I'm not saying every actor now has to portray a gay character, but the whole thing now, and it's just going to get the best actor for the role, going to, you know, build characters that are, you know, just make sense. But the whole art seemed to be that we must have, and everything that we put out has to have same-sex relationship, has to have a mixed race relationship, it has, you know, and you go, yeah, I get it, the world is that way, but we're now sort of, we had a long time there where we just ignored, and I use this word, and I don't mean any disrespectful to anybody when I say this, but we've to ignore the norm, right? We've to ignore that the UK is normally white, Christian, 2.2 children. That's quite a big bulk of your society. But when you watch anything in the arts, you'd think, I must be the only person that's white and middle-aged now, but what I'm trying to say here, I'm just trying to give you a commentary through my eyes. But I think back then in the 80s, it was a pretty shitty thing. And then the whole AIDS thing, I don't know what age you are, but living through that is it's sort of demonising, particularly gay men. And this thing that was going to kill the world was their fault.
Yeah.
So we've came a long way since then, and I think it's pretty all right now, the situation that the LGB community are in.
There's more stigma of being homophobe than there is in being homosexual now, to be fair.
That is a great, that is a great way of doing it. But how easy is it to have that, how easy is it to have any phobia flung at you now? That's another scary thing that I mean, as I say, I told you an example with me 10 years ago. I'm apparently a homophobic racist bigot. And another great one is, I love this one. I got a piece put in the Telegraph by, that's terrible, I forgot her name. Lovely girl. Camilla Turner, right? So I gave her some stuff about what Hamza Youssef had done with a charity donation. And she put a paragraph on it and said, I got this information from a Glasgow YouTuber, Craig Houston Talkston, right? So my subscriptions went up quite a lot that week. However, Hamza Youssef didn't like it. And Hamza Youssef, at the time, was the First Minister of Scotland, and he'd done a 9-page rant on Twitter an hour after the story broke. And everybody was an Islamophobe, right? And he actually referred to me without referring to my name. He said, I can't believe someone in the mainstream media has taken the word of an Islamophobic far-right online conspiracy theorist. And I thought, all I done was get an FOI. So the stuff that I gave Camilla, the irony is, your government gave me it and an FOI. I looked at the information and thought, this is a bit smelly. I give it to, and I tried to get it in Scottish papers first, because that was quite difficult, and it ended up having to get to the Telegraph before someone would write it. So, read into that what you may. And the Scottish First Minister then takes to social media to refer to me as something I am totally not. And you think, if the First Minister can do it, then anybody can do it. And you're right. And if somebody is an Islamophobe or a transphobe or a homophobe, then quite rightly call them out on it. But it's now just a word to silence someone and end of debate. And you don't have any input now because you're a homophobic racist bigot, apparently. So you're not allowed to debate anything. You're not allowed to input anything into society. And that's where we are. So see this story that I wanted to put out to people that are maybe similar to me, my understanding of this whole thing with the LGB falling out with the trans. Is there anything I've missed out, Jo?
To be honest, loads.
Right.
But it's such a big topic.
Yeah, have I got the sort of main ones though? Have I got the sort of?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think there are some really good organisations that I should probably give a bit of a plug to. So there's the LGB Alliance, who have, and there are lots now within every political party as well. There are caucuses that have sort of got a thing about sex-based rights. There's like a lesbian labour group. So, there was a growing grassroots opposition that I think is building, but it is still very much an opposition. And I think we're going to see, I'm worried about what's going to happen after the election, because I don't trust Keir Starmer at all to protect women's rights. He's been so despicable to Rosie Duffield. Well, it's kind of such a big topic. It's been keeping me writing for like the past God knows how long, and I suspect will continue to do so. So yes, there's stuff you've missed out, but don't worry about it.
There's no main stuff. And the thing that I'd like to ask you is the rainbow flag, which was such a beacon, it was such a in-your-face, obvious thing. Anytime you seen it, it was LGB rights, marriage, whatever it was. We're sorting out just now, and it's been ambushed. It's been bastardised is maybe a harsh word to use for it, but and every week it seems to get another chevron and a colour on it. How do the LGB community regain their flag? Or do they? Do they just say, you have it, bugger off, do your own thing? Because it's such an emblem for that community.
Yeah, I mean, if I see a sort of progress pride flag, as it's called, like the one with a chevron on it and all the rest of it, I know that that's the space that I won't be welcome, which is such a turnaround because, you know, it used to give me a little lift if I saw a rainbow flag. And now it's just like, no, that's somewhere you won't be welcome, particularly if it's the new style one. I think, I mean, there have always been tensions, but not like this. So there have always been tensions, for example, well, between lesbians, gays and bisexuals, because I think fundamentally, I think particularly when it comes to lesbians and gays, you know, essentially male sexuality and female sexuality, I think are quite different. So there's always been, but they're kind of, you know, I think, I know that, for example, you mentioned the AIDS crisis earlier, obviously a lot of lesbians really put their necks on the line for gay men. And it has been lesbians, I think, mainly who have been leading the fight back against the sort of trans takeover, if you like. And I don't think they've necessarily seen the same level of support that they once gave, which I think is in part a practical thing, because obviously it's not really, men's spaces aren't under threat in the same way. I mean, there have been reports of women who think they're men going into gay men's saunas and stuff like that.
Let me get my head around that one again.
Yeah, so that actually was an NHS-funded organisation that made a guide to explain to straight women who think they're men how to like wrap a towel around themselves in such a way as they can go into a gay men's sauna, which is basically for sex, and con a gay man, which is sex by deception. That's illegal. That's a crime. But yeah, Clinic Q put that out. So, you know, so there is, I think there have always been factions and tensions, but nothing like this. And I mean, the T has absolutely no association with the LGB. It's an identity thing, not about not a sexuality thing.
So, I mean, it's just bizarre how many different things that this whole thing gets into. I mean, that thing with the sauna, that's just bonkers, right? Yeah. And I think there's a bit of me getting a little bit of my sanity back, that I now understand that I'm not a lunatic, right? Because I was starting to go, imagine, am I an old bigot, right? Am I an old bigot by standing up and saying, no, I don't think that's right, that geezer should get into that toilet, right? And probably uncomfortable talking about it. But now that I've spoke to, it was like, honestly, it was like an amazing moment when I clicked on this guy's profile on Twitter to start following him, and I saw this thing and I went, hold on a minute. See if lesbian and gay and bi people don't like what's going on and they're allowed to talk about it, I think it's kind of all right if I do it now, right?
Yeah.
And it was a complete eye-opener for me. And it's given me a wee bit of faith back in humanity that we're not, I'm certainly maybe not bonkers. I might be bonkers, but not particularly on this subject. And, you know, I'm more comfortable now and I feel more at ease talking about it, because totally bigoted what I'm about to tell you next. I felt if I spoke out about it before, when I was talking about trans people and questioning what's going on, I would get a pile on by all the gay guys and all the lesbian women, because my perception was
not the same.
This whole thing. So the fact that it's quite liberating for me, because I'm going, yes, gays and lesbians can talk about it, so can Craig, right? And you're like, because you know, you've been quite mindful in the past, certainly in the last sort of 5 years, and what you can and can't say to be accepted or just shouted down. And I think, and this little journey that I'm on, I'm finding it in so many different aspects as well, that we are getting a wee bit more common sense and logic. You know, like, that's evidently wrong, right? You cannot go into that toilet with these young girls, right? So that's now the middle, that's now the centre. You with me? Whereas if I felt previous to that, if you spoke out like that, you were away over to the right. But no, it's actually central. And, you know, I think we're getting the same way. I feel that now we can almost talk about immigration without being a racist, you know? Because if you get to the point, my thing with immigration is there are certain areas where we need immigration. And that it's twofold. That can be people in the world that are really, their lives are threatened and they're, we've got a civil duty to maybe look after these people. I don't have a big issue with that, right? As long as it's done in a proper manner. But also where we might have, if we had no brain doctors in the UK, then, in another country across the world, there's loads of brain doctors, and that's just common sense. But where we have illegal and uncontrolled immigration, I think that's a different debate. Now, if I was to say that out loud, even 2 or 3 years ago, I'm a racist. Yeah. But now I think we're getting to a point in society where we can have debates and discussions that without having to, still pigeonhole you, that as soon as you open your mouth about a subject,
I had to say, I'm not X, but,
Yeah, I was doing that. I used to say I'm not a racist because I run a kids' football club and 16% of the kids are black. And I'm like, stop saying that, Craig, right? I don't need to justify it. But that was what you had to do. And then when I started investigating this topic, I did do it. And the first ever person that I said, look, can I talk to you about this, right? And I had to tell them that I had 2 friends that had come out to me first when they were coming out as gay. I had to tell them that. And I had to tell them about my mate whose daughter's just recently come out gay and how right? And then I was able to talk to him and I thought, Craig, what are you doing? Just fucking talk to them, right? I don't need to justify that I am not homophobic anymore. You're with me?
Because totally.
Just get on with it. But you're right, that I am not but. Is that the definition of a bigot now? Is that what we've sort of covered that?
Isn't it?
I mean, sorry, Jo, you were saying?
Oh, no. I was just going to say, it's funny what you were saying about Islamophobia earlier. I mean, actually, I hate that term because I think it's everybody's duty to be critical of religion generally, as a rule, whatever that religion. So to be honest, I don't like that. I don't like the term Islamophobia because I feel like it sort of shuts down. It's not racist to question certain tenets of somebody's faith just because the majority of people of that faith happen to be a certain colour.
That's a great point. Being able to question any religion shouldn't be a bad thing. But the way we found it up here, particularly when we had the Humza as the first minister, you could question Humza on housing, and you were an Islamophobe, and you're like, what? How's that? How's that? We've not to question Humza, because if you do, you're an Islamophobe. You're like, well, that's not how democracy works. That's not how politics work. So you have to get this guy that we can't question, regardless of what it is. If we had a homosexual first minister, which we may or may not have had in the past, does that mean if you were to question him or her, then you're homophobic because you're like, shut up, right? Just get on with it. And we need to get away from that as society. But it's interesting you made that. I'm not homophobic because I'm justifying it, but you're right, I'm not homophobic, but, and then you come out with something nonsense. I think what you're saying about Islamophobia makes perfect sense for 2 reasons. One, you should be able to challenge religion, and just because you challenge someone of a particular religion doesn't mean you're anti that religion at all. It just means you get an opposite opinion on them. Where do we go? See if somebody says, I just don't like Craig. Can we give them an obia at the end of a white homosexual? I'm not homosexual. I'm just saying a white heterosexual. Get my words mixed up now. Old guy, right? What are you if you talk out against me? Can I get a phobia, please, to throw back at these people?
Craigism.
Craigism. You're a Houstonism. Aye, Houstonobia. Aye, there we go. That works. Anyway, Jo, it's been lovely talking to you. And I really, I think it's. I probably knowingly spoke to more people in the LGB community in the last 2 months than I probably knowingly spoke to in the last 10 years. And it's bizarre, isn't it? And it's probably because we're saying, isn't it? We don't say to folk, are you one of those gay people or are you one of those heterosexual people? It just doesn't bloody matter. That's it. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention about the kids, through Lindsay, who's the Newcastle supporter, right? Hopefully doing a podcast with her on our football story. I was talking to her about it, and I was reaching out to everybody that I knew that was in the LGB community. Go, if I get this right, I'm allowed to hate these people now and say that they're crackers because you're doing it now, right? So anybody that I knew, I'm like, tell me this. And they were everybody in the LGBT community that I've spoke to has the exact same thoughts on it, right? But that doesn't mean it's 100% of the community. It just means it's 100% of the people I know or spoke to. But her fear on it was fantastically put. She says, Craig, when I was a young girl, I liked football. If we were playing princes and princesses in a group of girls, I would be the prince. If we were playing doctors and nurses, I'd be the doctor, right? She said, and if an 8-year-old Lindsay was 8-year-old today, I'd be put into that box.
Yeah.
She said, that's what I'm scared of, the 8-year-old Lindsays that are not are not going to be like she is. I think she's 32-year-old, quite happily, lesbian female. She went, that journey's no a guarantee anymore. And that's bloody scary.
It's,
All because of pounds, shillings, and pence.
I think so. I think so. Yeah. I also think you need the idea of you need the fiction of a transgender child for adult men to pretend that they've always innately been women.
Run that bit by me again, because what you said doesn't comprehend me, because I think that's such a bizarre thing. Could you let me process that again?
So I think you get a lot of adult men who identify as trans who kind of retcon their childhoods. They say, I always felt this way because I used to, I don't know, try on my sister's shoes when I was 6, whatever it happens to be. And I think if you take away the idea that it's innate and that they've always had this kind of feminine essence somehow trapped in them, that they've then, you know, realized at the age of 43 after having 3 kids and 2 marriages. I think if you take away the idea of that being innate, you kind of expose it as a fetish. So I think a lot of these straight men who say they're lesbians need the conception of the transgender child, so they can point to them and say, look, you see they exist. So I think actually these children are kind of fig leaves for men's fetishes, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely disgusting and worrying, isn't it?
But do you know what I mean? I think there's that sort of, you know, it makes it a natural thing rather than just a fetish.
Aye, and we the weird thing is, for a long period of time, we were trying to normalise that. And in Scotland, we were trying to aid that. And it just worries the hell out of me, you know. Up here, see the Greens in the UK Greens, right? The ones that go in county councils and stuff down south. Are they the same as the Scottish Greens, right? And I'm probably as well explaining to you what I feel a Scottish Green is just now. When the Green Party started, they were you two. Their early stuff was all right, and they lost their way a bit, right? The Green Party started as an environmental thing. They had some fears about the environment, and they wanted to be activists, and that led into politicians, etc. So I kind of get that. But I watched a party political broadcast by the Scottish Greens just last week, and they never mentioned one thing about the environment. And I go, well, how did that become a thing? They are more interested in trans rights than they are in the environment. Due to that, on that one party, why would the Scottish Greens do a party political broadcast, give them a great chance to talk to the nation that are hopefully going to vote for them, and not talk about the environment? Now, is that unique to the Scottish Greens, or is that the way the whole Green movement's going?
I think that's across the board. I think there's now like a set of beliefs, whether it's Palestine, whether it's that you kind of have to tick box if you consider yourself progressive, and obviously the Greens consider themselves progressive. Maybe they within England. So I know there's been a split, hasn't there, between the Scottish Greens and the UK Greens. I think over the trans issues, that might be why the Scottish Greens were pushing it more. Having said that, the sort of main people within, so I think it's Carly Denyer and various others within the English Green Party, or Green Party England and Wales, are very much pro self-identification, pro trans, and yes, predictably pro everything else that kind of you can put on a slogan. So I know there have been a couple of people that have taken legal cases. There was Shoa Ali. So he's a gender critical man who was in the Green Party, and he was sort of discriminated against, and he took him to court and won. And I think there's an ongoing case with a woman called Emma Bateman, who was a women's officer, and then she was basically sort of frozen out or daring to question this nonsense. And I think there's a group of Green Party lesbians as well, who were gender critical. So there is factions within the Green Party in England and Wales, but I think there's slightly more room for debate just because it's been forced as a legal issue than there is in Scotland.
Yeah, and the mad thing was, it was the downfall of Hamza Yousaf. I would love to take credit for that, and so would loads of other people. But the reality is, we had this coalition government up here with the Greens and SNP. And the SNP said something that not the Green Party, not the Scottish Greens, but the Scottish Greens Rainbow Party, right, didn't like. And what they'd done was, it was quite clever. There's a bit of their constitution that if 100 members call for an extraordinary general meeting to vote on any particular subject, then they must have the extraordinary general meeting. And they were calling for the Butte House Agreement to be dissolved, right? So the Greens knew this was happening. And then that eventually led to, and then other factors flew in, and the Butte House Agreement was put in the bin. And then Hamza Yousaf eventually stood down because it made them now a minority government. And I thought the total irony of that is one of the most, what's the word I'm looking for? Radical parts of the most radical party in Scotland caused the downfall. So we're talking about that amount of people in the whole scheme of things that brought down potentially a government, because now they're so precarious.
Popular, is it?
It's what?
It's not popular, is it? This sort of ideology.
Aye, but the whole thing, so now their whole democracy, I'd be delighted if the SNP government fall, because I don't particularly like them, but the whole idea now is that the whole democracy could be brought down by such a small part of the whole political picture. It's just bonkers.
Yeah.
But that's where we are. So, and the Scottish Greens, what was it they came out with the other day? Oh, it's back to these Quangle things. There's a guy, Ross Greer, who is one of their spokesmen. He's quite a young politician. The boy's bonkers, right? I don't think he's lived a normal working life in his whole short time. And there was a video of him at some committee that he's managed to get on about education. And the person for they bring in they call them stakeholders, which is just a buzzword for folk we know they'll agree with what we are trying to drive, right?
Friends.
So so the stakeholder brought in now was a trans man kidding on he's a woman, and about ages with Ross. And you know that way, if you're watching a cartoon and somebody's feeling passionate about somebody, you see the little love hearts coming out their head. That's what I seen when Ross was asking this other person a question. And the two of them were talking the biggest lot of shite ever about education. And you're like, so then I looked at this person's profile, and yeah, my guess that they were a guy was confirmed, because they identified as a trans woman, so they obviously were a man. And guess what? They're a green activist. And you go, why are we accepting this? Why have we let this become a thing that you're going to sit in this committee, make very important decisions for the rest of Scotland? You've got there after 1,100 votes in your constituency, right? Because you got a regional seat. And you've brought your pal in to give evidence as a stakeholder on very important questions that we're going to answer, very important decisions we're going to make about education in Scotland.
Essentially, a grim word for it would be incestuous, which I think a lot of Scottish politics, there seems to be a revolving door between sort of organisations that get funding from the Scottish government and organisations that end up being consulted by the Scottish government. I can see it's kind of, corrupt, really.
Just a big circle. That's what I was. So where does this thing go for you, Jo? Where does this campaign to get common sense and logic back in as mainstream go with you? What happens next in your life, and do you see this? Where do you see this whole thing going next?
So I think something that groups in England are calling for is the repeal of the Gender Recognition Act, which I think is, I think that's some way off. I think it's worth aiming for, but I'm not sure we're quite there yet. Some people are calling for the Equality Act to be scrapped. I disagree with that, because I actually think the Equality Act could be used to fight this. So like a lot of the sex-based rights have been positioned in opposition to those based on so-called gender reassignment. So actually, I don't think that's necessarily the way to go. I think as a wider point, more people are starting to understand the connections between pornography as a driver for some men's identification as the opposite sex. So I'm at the moment I'm writing a book about pornography, and I'm hoping to sort of explore some of the connections. There's a very good researcher called Genevieve Gluck who runs a magazine called Redux, and she does a lot of digging down into this as well. So I think probably looking at it as a social media contagion, looking at in girls in particular, looking at the sort of pornographic roots of it for men and boys. And I think actually something that's been really important is, as you've said you've spoken to people that you might not have spoken to. I think linking up. So I don't care what someone's politics are. I don't care what religion are. I just don't care. It is so good to be able to sort of work across political and social divides to get this done.
No, and I totally agree with that. And the two things you mentioned there, the first thing was the sort of link to pornography. I'd never even considered that until you and I spoke last week on the telephone at some length. And then, I'll just revert back to the podcast I recorded Monday, I beg your pardon, with Neil Hanvey. Now, Neil Hanvey is a nationalist. Neil Hanvey is homosexual. Neil Hanvey is... There's a thing between the East Coast and the West Coast of Scotland. Sometimes we don't get on as well as we should, right? So I'm from one and he's from that. So in very, very broad sweeping statements, we're quite opposite in a lot of things. But just actually, I would say we got on really, really well. And there's the amount of stuff that we agree on. And I think, I don't know how it happened in England, right? But there's this polarisation in politics and a lot of social questions. I think in Scotland was driven with the referendum in 2014. It was horrific. That 2-year run up to that, Scotland was a horrible place to live. It was the first time in my life where my relationship with me in a ballot box had to be public. Up until that point, when I would vote, for example, when I was married, I'd come home from the polling station, the wife might say to me, "How did you vote?" And you'd say, "Oh, I voted for that guy." And that was it. That was about as far as the conversation's got. It might be the odd person at work. But in the run up to the Scottish referendum, people were demanding to know how you were voting. And we were daft enough to make that the norm. So now in Scotland, I understand how that's eventually evolved into every topic. It does not matter the topic. There's a demand that you must wear that badge here. Now, the middle ground's not accepted. See if you go, I don't really know, I'm not really that bothered. Oh, what do you mean? I mean, this is the most important thing in my life, so it's got to be the most important thing in your life. What do you think about gay marriage? That might have been 20 years ago. What do you think about abortion? What do you think about trans issue? What do you think about... You're like, going to just leave me alone. But the whole thing now, in so many different aspects of life, is polarised. Central ground isn't allowed. And everybody demands to know your opinion. And I'm like, what? Is it social media that's got us there? You've mentioned social media has been a part in this. Is that what's driving this whole thing?
I think, particularly for younger people, I think there's this sort of idea that you have to put the right things in your social media bio. That, the right flags, the right this, the right that. And I think those sort of like cultural indicators, those sort of identifiers, I think if you don't have a very strong sense of self because you've built it all online, I think that means you can't argue your point because you're kind of insecure about it, because it's something that's been developed because you're aware that you're essentially in like a panopticon, like, other people can constantly see you and what you're saying online. So I think that creates a real insecurity. There's no room to kind of question or change your mind without being sort of jumped on. Yeah. And I think that can feel quite personal if you kind of associate who you are with who you are online. So yeah, I think actually it probably is social media.
How do we sort that, Jo?
So I've been reading, it might be behind me. Oh, it's not. I've been reading quite a good book by Jonathan Haidt recently, which is about the impact that smartphones have had, particularly on children. I think we've got to stop kids having iPhones, really. I think that's, or just sort of, you know, restrict the time severely. Certainly shouldn't have them in schools. I think, and I think we've got to hold social media companies accountable. You know, whether that's Elon Musk for allowing porn on Twitter or whatever the hell it happens to be, I think we've got to start actually legislating to hold them accountable.
I noticed something just this morning, which I actually read wrong initially. And then when I read it again, I thought, well, that's actually probably not a bad thing. And Elon Musk is putting a thing on. I thought it said that they were taking away the like button from X. Still call it Twitter. It's not in there yet. So, right. And I thought, well, why are you taking away the like button? But then when I looked into it, no, what they're doing is, see, when I go and like something that you've said, I will have the ability to have that like anonymous or public. So you know the way you can click on a like, and if it's at 178 likes, you'll see the 178 people have liked it, and then if you want to be a nutcase, you can go and abuse them, right? Because you don't agree with them. So, and I thought, that's good. Because I know people, well, a great example of that would be Lindsay, where I don't believe everything that she was blamed for. It was, and we've seen it with MPs and politicians, that they're actually getting cancelled, not because of what they've said, or not because of what they've shared, but because they've clicked a little like button. And I do that often, just to try to say people, thanks for even reading.
That's what did it for Rosie Duffield. She liked a Piers Morgan tweet.
That's right. You're like, so, you know, that's a step. And again, when I read it this morning, I thought, he's taking away the like button. That's bonkers. And then when I thought, oh, hold on a minute, that actually makes sense to me. So if I'm quite happy to publicly like something, people still see Craig Houston like this. But if I think it's a bit that could come back and haunt me and somebody might want to throw bricks at my window, I can like it anonymously. And I thought, well, that's a step, and it's that size, but we've got that amount of journey to go. But yeah, I don't know the answers. I'm no specialist in sociology or the bloody internet and social networks, but I think it's got to get better because it's insanity. And this whole thing started. There was the cancel culture when that became a thing, and I thought, well, who gets to decide? Who are these mystical, magical people that get to decide what is and is not acceptable? And I think as human beings, we've all got a filter that when we are horrifically obnoxious and hurtful to people, we actually know before we say it or do it. So we have this filter that goes, oh, hold on a minute, Craig, don't calm down, take a step back. So we are able to control that ourselves, but what's happened, it's been forced upon us and our filters are having to be risen. And I'm a great example of that. I would never have spoken about this subject 6 months ago for fear of the response, the repercussion of social media. And I think that the wee journey I'm going on is quite healthy. You know, I'm talking to people outside my normal bubble with, you know, about things that, and I think if we could do that as society, it might help. Anyway, it's been lovely talking to you, Jo, and as that, I'm really enjoying this sort of journey of education I'm on just now. So thank you very much for educating a slightly old grumpy heterosexual white guy from Glasgow. You know, I really appreciate your time. Yeah, and I say often to people that the greatest gift you can give anyone is your time, and I can only thank you for the amount of time you gave me last week in the run up to this interview, and the time you've gave me this morning. It's been fantastic. So thank you very much, Jo.
Thank you too. Time well spent.
Guys, if you've enjoyed the podcast, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not already done so, please consider subscribing. I'll put some links into Jo's social media as well in the comments, so you can follow her. She's been a great educator to me, which I thank her for. And as I do with all of my podcasts, the most important thing, unless you're one of these nutcases that's driving this trans thing and trying to make it normal and ruin the life of your kids, to everybody else in the world, have a great day. Cheery bye now.